Well, Dave Richard joins me now of CBS Sports HQ. You can find him on Twitter at Dave Richard as well. Dave, it's great to see you again. Thanks for being with me.
You must have won your league last year because you're having me back on, Carolyn. I appreciate it.
Well, you are my go-to guy for everything fantasy. I love everything that you've been doing on CBS Sports HQ. And one of the things I really enjoyed about our conversation last time was just how digestible you made everything for everybody who is new to fantasy, who is a veteran of fantasy and loves that world and is fully immersed in that world. I feel like when they go to you, you get a little bit of everything, including some education into some different type of drafts that aren't the traditional snake draft. I know you guys have been doing a lot around what you've been describing as a salary cap draft, which is interesting. Let's start there. I mean, explain for those who aren't familiar just how many different ways there are to get involved with fantasy, particularly fantasy football.
I love that you brought this up. So most people do a snake draft where everybody gets a spot and everybody takes their turn, like you're in elementary school picking players, and then the order reverses in the next round. A salary cap draft is different than that. It's like an auction. A player is nominated. Everybody in the league has a chance to get that player. Whoever bids the most from a fictional budget, it could be 100 fictional dollars. It could be 100 real dollars if you guys are going wild. It could be 1,000 fictional dollars or 1,000 real dollars. But whoever bids the most for the player gets the player on their fantasy team. And it allows fantasy managers the chance to kind of build dream teams a little bit. In a snake draft, there's no way you could have Jonathan Taylor and Derrick Henry on the same fantasy team. It can't be done. Someone's going to take Henry before you get the chance to if you take Taylor or vice versa. Some people don't have a chance to get either one of them because they're picking 10th. But in a salary cap draft, you can get both. Your wide receiver might be, Romeo Dobbs or something like that, but your stud running backs will be there on your team because you can spend up to get them on your team. So you can build dream teams. You could also build teams with great depth. I did one where I had a guy who has one guy with a first round ADP, two guys with a third round draft average. ADP means draft average, the point where you would draft a player in a snake draft, and then three more players with a draft average of rounds 4, 5, or 6. And I felt like I put together a team that I wouldn't be able to put together in a snake draft. So if you're watching and you're not sure what type of a league to start, the one that's more fun is the salary cap draft. And if you've been doing snake drafts for a long time, suggest it to your league commissioner to do a salary cap draft because those are more fun. But if you're just starting out, maybe it's your first or second time ever playing fantasy, you don't want to get too caught up in the weeds, you don't have a lot of time to spend on your draft, go with the snake draft. It's faster and it's easier to do.
Well, I love that for a fantasy player, the notion that they might not be hamstrung by ADP. And if they love a certain running back, a certain quarterback, a certain receiver, I mean, you can't have everything you want, but that they might be able to put together a scenario in which they kind of choose who can end up where on their team and get the players that they really want. I mean, how much increased popularity have you seen in this type of draft, a salary cap draft, compared to some of the traditional drafts?
Unfortunately, Carolyn, we've seen a lot of other areas of fantasy get bigger and better and more popular than this one. This is one that I would love. I wish I could go to the rooftops and start yelling, do your salary cap drafts. They're that much fun. They're that much better. But people have gravitated toward best ball drafts. We could talk about that if you want. People have really gravitated towards super flex and 2 quarterback leagues. So there's other things in fantasy that people have started to like better than salary cap drafts. But to me, there's no comparison. Salary cap drafts are fun. It's a way to build a team that you can't possibly build in a snake draft. And it's a great way to have camaraderie. And you get deals. Who doesn't love getting a deal when you go shopping? I got Michael Thomas for 7% of my budget in the salary cap draft that we did. So it's a $100 budget. I got Michael Thomas for $7. Chris Godwin went for twice that price. I love getting deals. That's a deal.
I am completely sold. And I'm also curious what the overall impact, I realize this question might have a little bit of nuance to it. It might be over my head, but sports betting has become so popular. More and more states are opening up to that. I mean, what has the impact been on fantasy leagues and the stuff that you're so passionate about?
It's been all positive, which I am really grateful for, because there was a point in time really when daily fantasy started that I thought that people would stop playing in their seasonal leagues and start playing more in daily fantasy. And it didn't happen. And I think the reason why it didn't happen, Carolyn, is because people love the camaraderie of being in a fantasy football league with their friends, with their coworkers, with their family. and it's fun to beat them. I play in a league every year with my brother-in-law. We are so competitive against each other. I hate it when he beats me, and I love it when I beat him, and I would never give that up. So I think the camaraderie with fantasy football has helped. Now, you talked about sports betting. Player props are becoming a huge thing. And the reason why I believe this, that this is becoming a huge thing, is because of fantasy football. People have been playing fantasy for years. It's helped them get closer to the game. There are players that they wouldn't know about because of fantasy football. They do know about them. And now they'll bet on whether or not they'll catch a touchdown or they'll get over 75.5 yards in a football game. And I think you're going to see that continue. And I think that that's going to end up being a supplement to people playing fantasy football. So they're still going to be in their leagues with their family and their friends. I'm still going to play against my brother-in-law, but I'm also going to find the time to put down some money on player props that I like every single week.
So that individual familiarity will continue to kind of enhance the water cooler moment, if you will, where everybody really just kind of benefits by being, I guess, better educated on who's out there and where the value is.
Yeah, I think so. I think that that's what it'll do.
Let's talk a little bit about some kind of general do's and don'ts. I know in the next couple of weeks, that's really where you mentioned the camaraderie of all this. Everybody's going to get together. They're going to grab a couple beers. They're going to have their fantasy drafts. I mean, it's something that so many people look forward to. As you kind of assess the landscape heading into the 2022 season, it was a wild free agency and off season. There are so many moving parts. How excited are you about this particular season? And where do you think there is some value in terms of both individual players that we might not be thinking of and also in position as you kind of assess the strategy, the do's and don'ts of how to approach 2022?
I think this is the most unpredictable season in the history of fantasy football. And I'm not saying that as hyperbole or anything else. I've been doing this I've been playing fantasy since the late 90s. I've been writing about fantasy football since 2003. I am old. And I'm also here to tell you that this offseason is like none other. And it's going to bleed over into the regular season because there's still going to be a little bit of rhythm issues between teams and teams starting to feel themselves out because of the huge turnover, especially among the big time players and especially the big time receivers around the National Football League. So where can fantasy managers win? I think as an analyst, I talk about how quarterbacks are kind of devalued in one quarterback leagues, and you can wait a little bit to take your quarterback. My strategy with quarterback is to take one at a really good value. I'm not willing to wait necessarily until round 10 to find my starting fantasy quarterback. But when I get to a point in my draft where I don't love the running backs and receivers and tight ends that are there, there's usually going to be a quarterback staring me in the face, and the value is going to be really good. And I'm also not going to be one of those managers that will chase a quarterback just because in my league, someone might take Josh Allen in round 1 or round 2. Someone might take Patrick Mahomes in round 2. I'm not going to chase a quarterback either. I'm just going to sit back and I'm going to wait until there's a good value. And the reason why I want to do that and not necessarily wait for a quarterback is because I think that's going to be the position this year that will consistently deliver big fantasy points for fantasy managers. I think we're going to see a lot of inconsistency at running back and at wide receiver. And we've always seen inconsistency among tight ends. That's going to continue to happen. But I think in this case, you want to find those stable players that you can just cross off and say, he's going to get me 25 points per week. There might be 4 guys like that at running back. There might be 6 guys like that at wide receiver. There's legitimately 8, 9 guys like that at quarterback. I want one of them on my team. That's going to be the position that will stabilize my team, and I'll deal with the consequences of all my other players later. So I'm not prioritizing the position, Carolyn. I'm not going to go and take Josh Allen before everybody else, but I am going to wait for a good value to appear instead of a great value or a late round value at the quarterback spot.
A couple questions for you then on specific quarterbacks, just because we're kind of in this zone. And you got so many young, talented quarterbacks, and then these veterans who have either moved locations or in a new situation. I think about Matt Ryan in Indianapolis, and I think that's one of the bigger question marks in my mind is how is he going to fare this season after everything we saw in Atlanta, where really he was consistent offensively in terms of his production and the numbers that he would put up each week, but didn't necessarily have the pieces around him to succeed. Do you foresee that situation being different in Indianapolis?
I think he's got better pieces around him in Indianapolis now than he did last year in Atlanta, or at the end of the year in Atlanta, because when the season started in 2021, not only did he have Kyle Pitts, but he also had Calvin Ridley. And those are 2 guys. I bet he wishes he had that type of depth, or at least playmaking depth at his wide receiver / tight end position in Indianapolis. I think the Colts love him. I think that the training camp reports have been great on him. He's a huge upgrade over Carson Wentz in their eyes. That means that they're going to be more willing to throw the football. But they've also got that stud workhorse in Jonathan Taylor in their backfield. So it'll probably be a balanced offense. They might be 55-45 pass run, something like that. Matt Ryan could have a really good year. He could throw for 4,000 yards. He could have 26, 27 touchdowns. But I don't think he'd be good enough to even crack the top 12 with those types of numbers. And just going back to what I said about the quarterback position, this is a position where if you're not getting 4,500 yards and 30 touchdowns, you're not going to be a top 12 guy. You're not going to be a starting caliber guy. And the guys at the top of that list, that's 5,000 passing yards. Or in the case of Josh Allen, 4,500 passing yards and another 500 rushing yards, something crazy like that, and 40 touchdowns to go along with it. So what Matt Ryan might do, it might be good for him. It might be a bounce back year for him, but it might not register as top 12, maybe not even top 15 among quarterbacks. Now you talk about a lot of the rookie, or not, they're not rookies anymore. They're second-year quarterbacks. Trey Lance, Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields. Fantasy managers are gravitating toward them because of the upside, because Trey Lance playing 17 games might be able to work his way to 4,000 yards passing, but might also give you 1,000 rushing yards. He's a runner, and he can get you some good touchdowns on top of it. Same thing with Justin Fields. Trevor Lawrence, not as much of a runner, but boy, is he in a position in Jacksonville. That's a team with a questionable run game. Their best running back is actually a guy who's better as a pass catcher in Travis Etienne. His arm might fall off by the time the season ends, and Jacksonville could be trailing in a lot of games because their defense isn't that amazing. You could see Trevor Lawrence work his way up close to 5,000 yards and maybe around 32 touchdowns, something like that. And all those guys, they don't have the track record, the resume of Matt Ryan, but they're all in a better position to put up more fantasy points than Matt Ryan. That's the difference between fantasy and reality. If we were starting a football team, we'd probably want Matt Ryan. That's a guy who could lead us to the playoffs. But if we want a guy that can put up crazy stats, I'd look at those quarterbacks.
Yeah, it is interesting. So you're basically saying as a fantasy player, you would lean more towards these guys that we really do think about as rookies or who are somewhat unproven heading into their second year because of the risk reward for their upside compared to, say, an Aaron Rodgers, a Matt Ryan, a Russell Wilson, some of these guys who have been around. Am I reading that right? I mean, maybe there's more value with some of these younger guys who haven't shown us what they can do, but you have the potential to really do well in your league if you pick one.
And there are people who want to try and capitalize on that. That risk reward proposition, it really works in favor of quarterbacks, especially these second-year guys, because you can draft them late. I like to say that my rankings change by the time you get to round 10 for quarterbacks. Let's say we're in round 8 or round 9 and you're looking for a quarterback and Joe Burrow's there. Yeah, you could take Joe Burrow. Aaron Rodgers is there. I would take Aaron Rodgers. I would expect Russell Wilson to go ahead of these guys because he's one of those guys that changed teams. His outlook's changed. Fantasy managers are excited about it, so he's not even in this conversation. But when we get to round 10, and let's say Burrow and Rodgers and Derek Carr are still there, I'll take one of those second-year quarterbacks first, and I might not even start him in week 1. I would start Trey Lance in week 1. He's playing Chicago. That's going to look like a really good matchup. So I would take him, and then I'd double back in the next round, and I'd take the best available veteran quarterback. You can add Matthew Stafford to that list. And now I've got 2 quarterbacks on my team. I've got Trey Lance to start the season, and I've got a veteran quarterback to replace him in case he stinks, or even if he's playing good through the first 2 weeks of the season. He plays Seattle in week 2. By the time he gets to week 4, he's playing the Rams. I don't want any piece of Trey Lance against the Rams. I've got a quarterback on my bench ready to go that can start in place of him.
How much do you value the running back position in terms of where you would select a running back in the draft?
A lot. And you're talking to somebody who's been, I jump into the running back pool cannonball style every single year because it's the position, it's the most fragile position. Those guys get hurt the most, but they tend to put up the most points. And when you've got a great running back on your team, you've got someone that's getting you 25 PPR points per week. That's something that you really want to shoot for. Whereas at wide receiver, yeah, the best of the best might get you close to 25 PPR points per game. Last year, Cooper Kupp actually exceeded that. But the majority of the good wide receivers in fantasy, they're going to be anywhere between 17 and 13 PPR points per week. And there aren't as many running backs that can hit that range. So I'm shooting to get those guys first in my draft and go for wide receivers later on. Plus, there are more wide receivers that I like a little bit later on. So I encourage people to look at running back, and I think you're going to see it in drafts this year. The majority of the picks in the first round, I think you can pencil in 8 of them will be running backs. Maybe in non-PPR leagues, it could be all 12 or 10 of the first round picks are running backs. And then wide receivers start to come off the board next. It just depends on whether or not catches count. But I think it's a very important position to fill. I've seen a lot of fantasy managers say, running backs are weak, you don't need them. And they load up on wide receivers early in their draft, and it looks great after the draft. But then a wide receiver gets hurt or a wide receiver underperforms, and they never quite recover with their running backs. And they end up at best maybe being the 6th seed in their playoffs, and they lose in the first round. I just don't think it's a strategy to build a winning team.
And how do you feel about the tight end position as well? Because I noticed at the top of our conversation, you mentioned maybe a little bit of volatility or then there being more of an X factor there in terms of what they ultimately do. I mean, is the tight end position something that should be a lower priority than, say, securing a running back, securing a quarterback, and maybe picking up a wide receiver that could give you something if they're still around?
This is something that I think every fantasy manager has to answer before they go into their draft. And they also should know where they're picking in a draft or how much of their budget they're willing to dedicate to a tight end in the case of a salary cap draft. This is not a deep position. It's a shallow position. And really, once you get past, I would say, I'm looking at my tight end rankings right here. I would say there's 8 tight ends that you can look at and say, that's a guy I can draft to be my starter all season long. There are very few leagues with 8 managers. Most of them have 10 managers, 12 managers, 14 managers. The more managers you have, the more of an advantage you'll have if you reach for Travis Kelce. And I say reach for Travis Kelce, but he's been worth taking in late round 1. I call him a top 15 pick. You don't have to take him in round 1, but if you really want to lock him up, you want to have that edge over the rest of your competition, he's a tight end who performs like a top 10 fantasy wide receiver every single year. And all the changes that are happening in Kansas City's offense, I don't think it affects him. I actually think it helps him because he's the guy that Patrick Mahomes is most familiar with. He's the one that Mahomes might lean on a little bit more as the season rolls on. So I think he's worth that first round pick. I think Mark Andrews, I think he's worth more of a third round pick, which is still really high for a tight end. But a lot of people might say, I don't want that advantage. I don't think it's a good advantage at tight end. I'd rather wait on the position. There are guys that you can just use at the beginning of the year. I think Cole Kmet is someone that's got some upside if you're looking for a breakout tight end that you can draft and hope, fingers crossed, that it gives you a lot of fantasy points over the course of the season. But that's a decision that you're going to have to make, and you can't really middle it either. You can't say, oh, well, I don't really want to spend a lot of draft capital on it. You're going to see 5 tight ends go off the board after the first 5 rounds of your draft, and then there's only going to be maybe 2 or 3 more, and then you're looking at round 9, and then Cole Kmet is as good as it's going to get. And I'm sorry, but Bears players this year kind of scare me a little bit. That offense doesn't look so great. I'm not sure that Cole Kmet will end up being great for fantasy fortunes.
You know, most of us go in, Dave, to our fantasy draft with a wish list of players that we would love to get if you do a traditional snake draft, and then you kind of watch them all get peeled away and you get what you get. But I noticed you wrote something interesting that it's just as important to identify who you don't want to draft going into draft season as it is to kind of know who you would really like. Can you flesh that out for me a little bit further?
Sure. It's my don't want to draft list. It's players that are going at a point in drafts that I just don't think is worth it. They're basically overvalued. Or if you're thinking like a stockbroker, they're underweight. Or overweight, I guess I should say. This is why I'm not a stockbroker, Carolyn, because I'm not sure what exactly I mean, but they're not worth the money. That's a way to put it. And in this case, they're not worth the ADP. I can give you an example that's going to hurt some people's feelings. Josh Allen is not worth a round 1 pick. Not when you've got to start 2 running backs, 2 or 3 wide receivers, a tight end, and there are so many other quarterbacks. Tom Brady's ADP is in like round 8. All he did last year was finish 2nd in fantasy points per game, and now he's got Julio Jones and a healthy Chris Godwin, and they added Russell Gage. He's going to be great. If I could have any quarterback and I can get him in round 8, it would be Tom Brady. But Josh Allen going in round 1, I don't agree with that. And I especially don't agree with Patrick Mahomes being the 2nd quarterback off the board. I think Justin Herbert's in line for a better year than Mahomes. And I'm starting to get to the point where I think Lamar Jackson might be in a better position to have better numbers end of season than Patrick Mahomes. So that's somebody else who I look at and I say, I don't want to draft him. I don't want to take him in his ADP. If he's there somehow in round 4 or round 5, sure, I'll consider it. But I don't expect him to be there in round 4 or round 5 in most of my drafts. So those type of players, coming up with a list of players where you go down a list and you go, yeah, I don't want them. Maybe it's because they've hurt your team in the past. Maybe it's because you've read something bad about them. Maybe you just don't want to draft them for whatever reason. It could be because of their age. It could be the team they're on. It could be their coach, whatever. You make that list, that shrinks the rankings for you. And it makes you feel better when someone else takes that player in your league, because you go, aha, that's a player I don't want. I would have never taken him, especially at the spot where that manager took him. And I'm going to be able to get the player that I do want with my next pick.
That's really, really fascinating to hear you kind of break down why Josh Allen might not have the value that I think most people, myself included, would think about him and go, oh, yeah, I definitely would take him if he was available at the quarterback position. Lamar Jackson, I don't know if it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. He struggled, last season and has been dealing with some injury issues. So you expect him to have something of a rebound year this year now that he's healthy and hopefully can be more productive?
I think he's got a chip on his shoulder. I think he wants to prove that last year was a fluke. I think he passed the ball poorly last year, and all indications out of Ravens camp is that he's throwing a little bit more accurately this year than he did last year. He also put on muscle, which normally we don't like when a player puts on weight. But in the case of Lamar Jackson, I think it's meant so that he can hold up better, so he can take more hits in the pocket. His arms look good. He's strong. And I think that he's got a chance to survive the season. I think that's a goal of his. And you know that he's still going to be able to run the football really well. He's very fast. He's like a Tesla out there on the field with the speed that he's got. But if he's more determined to throw, that's good too, because that's an area that he lacked in terms of efficiency pretty much his entire career. He was made in fantasy because of his rushing. And I still think he's going to run a lot. He's still a candidate for 1,000 rush yards. But if he's throwing the ball better, man, that's great for his numbers. That means more touchdowns for him. And it means good numbers for Mark Andrews, who I kind of didn't love when we talked about him earlier, but I would take him in round 3. And Rashad Bateman is a breakout wide receiver. He's going to be on the other end of a lot of those targets from Lamar Jackson. And they might throw quite a bit in Baltimore because their run game, kind of a question mark with the health of their running backs right now. I think Lamar Jackson could be in for a really strong year.
Lamar Jackson aside, are we seeing a shift in the NFL to more pure passers at the quarterback position? How closely do you follow the trends of what teams are doing offensively? Because it does kind of ebb and flow. Everything is cyclical. They always say that, nothing is original in the NFL. Everything is just kind of regurgitated and shifted and renamed. But it feels like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we're kind of starting to leave that era of the Lamar Jackson, Cam Newton, highly mobile quarterbacks who are freak athletes, and maybe kind of return to some of the more traditional passing quarterbacks that we've seen. I mean, what impact fantasy-wise do all of those kind of NFL trends ultimately have on who you select and why heading into a season?
I think a way to succinctly say it, and this is a way that everybody's heard it, is that it's a copycat league, except the NFL is copying what's happening in college. And what they're doing, and this is really smart, they're implementing, when they draft a quarterback, they're playing to his strengths. The Steelers aren't a good example. The Niners are a good example. The 49ers didn't draft Trey Lance and then say, you're going to follow our system. You're never going to leave the pocket. You're going to throw the ball all the time. You're never going to run the football. No, that's not what they're doing. They're doing the opposite. They are tailoring their offense to Trey Lance. They want him to run with the football. They want that dynamic in their offense, but they know that he can throw too. They want him to get better at that. There have been days in training camp where he has and where he hasn't, but that's what they're doing. Teams are molding their offenses to the quarterbacks that they're getting. The Jets are doing it with Zach Wilson. It's not quite working out the way the Jets had hoped because Zach Wilson is still struggling, but they're doing it there. And it makes sense. Just like the Jaguars are doing it with Trevor Lawrence. And Trevor Lawrence isn't one of these mobile quarterbacks that's going to go off for 1,000 yards in a season, but he is somebody who can throw the ball really well, hit those tight window throws 15 yards downfield, and throw a tight spiral in the red zone to score a touchdown for the Jaguars. They're building around him. That's the trend that we're seeing. And so when you watch football on Saturdays this year and you see the great college quarterbacks that are out there, CJ Strouds and Bryce Youngs, you're going to say to yourself, okay, when they go in the NFL, they're already going to have a leg up because they're going to go into an offense that will be built around them. I'm really comfortable saying now, I think the coaching staffs across the league have understood and they're adapting to it now. It wasn't always this way. 15 years ago, the offensive coordinator would throw the playbook down in front of the rookie quarterback and say, you're learning this. Now the coaches are learning the players, and they're the ones who are taking it to task to build a playbook to benefit the player with the skills that they already have. That's the trend I'm seeing.
So, and what's the practical application of that heading into the 2022 season specifically? I mean, as you kind of look at the 30,000 foot view, and I know that it's complicated to kind of look around the entire league and go, oh, it's more of a priority on running backs or wide receivers. But, are there, because there's naturally a trickle down effect of the natural ability from the quarterbacks who are coming out of these college football Saturdays into the NFL and what they do and how that affects the rest of the offense. I mean, what are you seeing to that effect in 2022 specifically, where a fantasy player could go, you know what, I think I'm going to do X when it comes to drafting a certain position?
I think if you're playing by the typical rules of a fantasy league, you're getting a point for every 25 yards passing and a point for every 10 yards rushing. And so if you've got a quarterback that's a good passer, but he runs the ball on top of it, well, you're getting a quarterback that can provide you a safe floor. Maybe not 25 fantasy points, like I said earlier. Maybe it's closer to 20, but that's the floor. That's the bare minimum of what you could expect them to score from week to week. I'm thinking of Jalen Hurts right now in Philadelphia. And look at what Philadelphia did last year. They started the season with Jalen Hurts. He wasn't great as a passer. They realized they could run the ball really well, though. And Hurts is a really good runner with the ball, too. His fantasy numbers cratered in the second half of last year, but they tailored their offense to his strengths at that time, and he helped them make the playoffs. It wasn't great for fantasy in the second half of the season. But now they've added A.J. Brown, and they've worked on the things that Jalen Hurts is good at as a passer. They're going to implement more of that in their offense. And now here's a guy who might throw for 225, 250 yards a week, but he also might run for 50, 60 yards in a week. And right there, without any touchdowns, that's 16 fantasy points. And if he scores a touchdown on top of it, now we're talking about that being 20 or 22 points, depending on your league scoring. And he gets another touchdown on top of that. Well, now we're shooting to the stratosphere, and it's helped because he's getting those 50 or 60 rushing yards. It is not a bad idea to specifically focus on guys who run the football a lot. Josh Allen does it. Jalen Hurts does it. Lamar Jackson definitely does it. Kyler Murray does it. It might shrink the list of quarterbacks that you want to draft, but it helps you develop fantasy points on your team.
Before I let you go, Dave, and I've kept you too long already, what are some of the most common questions that you've gotten heading into 2022 from fantasy players who are practiced at this and are getting ready to draft and are excited about this season?
The question that I'm probably getting the most is, what do I do with Christian McCaffrey? And people are very nervous to draft Christian McCaffrey. There's really two trains of thought here when it comes to CMC. All the fantasy managers remember what he did in 2019 and 2018 when he just dominated. He was getting close to 30 PPR fantasy points per week, and that's at running back. But he didn't do that very often in 2020 and 2021 because he was hurt a lot. He suffered 5 separate injuries over the last 2 seasons, and it's cost him 23 games. That's a lot, and people are going to remember that. So fantasy managers kind of have to decide for themselves, especially if they've got that early round pick. Do you want to invest in a running back who's gotten hurt a lot over the last 2 years, but he gives you so much upside? Or do you take another player that might not have the same type of upside, but should be able to last through the course of the season? That question's come up a lot. What I do with tight ends is a question that comes up a lot. I'm glad that you asked that. That comes through. And then I get asked a lot about the rookie class. There's a lot of rookie receivers this year that people are excited about. Treylon Burks has had some ugly headlines lately, but they're false. I think he's a guy that you might be able to take advantage of because of manipulated ADP. The average fantasy fan is going to say, he's running with the second team, he must stink. When in reality, he's been great in training camp all season long. You can ask anybody that's gone and watched the Titans practices, and he can end up being a huge part of that Tennessee offense, could get 120 targets in that offense. People are excited about Drake London. I just read a report before I came on the air with you that said that Drake London has started to kind of show himself more and more and look like a first-round pick more and more, catching passes from Marcus Mariota. Who knew that Marcus Mariota would be the one to unlock Drake London, but he's somebody else in line for 120 targets. And then if you go to Kansas City, Sky Moore is a very interesting name. He's someone that I thought would be like a contributor this year to the Chiefs, not necessarily someone who would be part of the game plan every week. I think he's working his way into getting into the game plan every week, and you can still draft him in round 9, round 10, round 11, and still feel good about it. He might end up being a number 3 fantasy receiver by the time the season ends. And I still didn't get to Chris Olave. I still didn't get to Garrett Wilson. I didn't get to Romeo Doubs. I didn't get to Alec Pierce. There are a ton of rookie wide receivers that can make a real interesting impact in fantasy. I'm getting asked a lot about them.
Where can people find more from you on all these rookie receivers and all the other players that you are so diligently profiling as everybody gets set to do their draft?
go to cbssports.com. You can find our fantasy rankings there. It's myself, it's Jamie Eisenberg, it's Heath Cummings. We're the fantasy analysts that are on Fantasy Football Today. That's our live show. It streams every day at noon Eastern on CBS Sports HQ. You won't find CBS Sports HQ on your cable channels, and that's a good thing. You can find it on anything that gets Wi-Fi. You just go to cbssportshq.com and you're watching. You don't have to give your email. You definitely don't have to give your credit card. Every day at noon Eastern, we're there giving free fantasy help and answering tweets too. And if you have any other questions, you can tweet me at Dave Richard and I'll get back to you.
Honestly, it couldn't be easier, Dave. I always learn something whenever we spend quality time together like this. Granted, we normally do it once a year, but we'll have to do it more than that. And in terms of a fantasy player that needs guidance and direction and doesn't want to have to, like you said, give their credit card, download a different app, figure out a way to find you guys, you make it super easy and you have such a great team. So thank you so much for being with me. I appreciate the preview.
Carolyn, always great to talk to you.